Hello everyone, today we talk about security, fear and vulnerability, and we go dark, or at least darker than the usual, as I realize that quite often for didactic sake on Schwerpunkt we present not an optimistic or positivistic or progressistic idea of military history, but definitely we tend to explain things in a rational, linear, logical way that can help naturally to understand better the picture. But the reality of any polemical relation is very different, right? And warfare is dominated by the condition of insecurity, of unintelligibility, and essentially of great concern for any event that causes properly fear. That is, from a moral point of view, already a declaration of weakness. We are all strong and weak, as we can be, but I have the impression that in our times we are getting very often distracted from the negative, tragic, dramatic ending of stories, right? Every time we talk about military history, after all, you are seeing it like, who was the winner, right? Who has made the greatest use of its force and has brought its future to a further stage. But we often forget the defeated. We often forget that behind any victory there is a much greater reverse of it from the other side, and very often a story of sufferance and effort and of great capacity that has a cost right from the side of the winner. It's an attitude that derives mostly from, broadly meant, especially in the last 80 years, I presume, in the Western world, from this fortunately generalized condition of wealth and of this availability of opportunities and all what you can imagine in the smoothing of actually very important difficulties that most areas of the world have brutally maintained or were used to. And losing the plot about the fact that all this reality can come to an end at a certain point, not necessarily from a day to another, or in an abrupt way that is catastrophic in an explosive manner, let's say, but specifically in a gradual descent, in a gradual sinking of our ability to cope with the reality, with the world, and with what this entire political, social, and even military experience of ours has been in so far. I presume that after 9/11 we have understood pretty clearly that a certain world and a certain worldview attached, Weltanschauung, is lost, right? The last decades in our history have been fundamentally marked by a generalized sense of malaise that from one side has naturally highlighted the problems of a world that had always had it in some ways, but in another sense there's been perhaps even a greater refusal of accepting or addressing and coping with the problem in order to find a solution. And this is not a display of intelligence, it's actually a great display of weaknesses that, not so surprisingly, is kept being exploited, right, by enemies, foreign or domestic, that can be literally ourselves, right? Unfortunately, there is not a formalistic approach to reality for which if I don't act, if I don't do anything, I can't be blamed for having done something. Very often it's the other way around. Very often the worst you can do is exactly pretending that behind your idea of individual freedom and of alleged superiority or capacity, accomplishment or success, there is actually a very passive and unsuccessful and incapable way of living your life, approaching the world, try to understand it. This enclosing, especially towards the idea of a foreign, of an external, an alien attack, is and I'm talking here really broadly, Matt. I mentioned 9/11 just before, but we could list an endless amount of other not just acts of terror, like in this case, eventually, but properly of attritions and struggles, and attempts also to divide ourselves by ourselves. This is very evident in the West, right? It's very evident in Europe. It's very evident at certain levels in certain societies that also have a specific ego that is greater than other countries, that very often obscure them, or create a narrative that definitely either ignores or puts in a very personal perspective certain concrete problems that, by admission, there is no interest or capacity very often to address. This condition of common interest could be extended naturally to the whole world, right? But even this should take into consideration that the world is not even, is different. Most of it is fundamentally dark, and there are just different shades of darkness in that regard. And it's not by getting intimidated by this at the point of refusing to realize it that you're going to do any service to what very often you pretend to defend, ideally or namely, right? How many people today that are so passionate and vocal about their political beliefs are actually even caring about picking a gun and going to fight in those places where really certain issues are decided literally by arms, by violence, and how many are just intimidated and lazy and weak and enclosed and dishabituated to any form of struggle. The realization should come, first of all, from the fact that we are all vulnerable. Nobody is beyond defeat. But this doesn't mean that we have fear to dictate our guideline, let's say. I remember the Lieutenant General Thomas Jane Stonewall Jackson on June the 18th, 1862, stating, "Never accept advice from your fears," right? And there are important, let's say, episodes, examples, topoi in our culture that bring us back to the realization of what threat really means and how to cope with it, not essentially giving up to fear, but on the contrary, right, getting boosted to react as a consequence and spending resources for it. Probably here we have this beautiful picture of Siegfried being killed by Hagen, but it's very evocative, at least in the 19th century, which I presume 19th century picture, or 20, I don't know, but I presume 19th. But that's a particular context also between warriors, and that is quite meaningful in its own regard. But probably the best example that we can draw is for Achilles' death, right? Achilles is not a figure like others, right? There is not an alternative figure to it, not even Siegfried, right? By scale of importance in our civilization, Achilles has a deep meaning. Our world has been obsessed, as you know, by the Iliad as a paradigmatic reality that is indeed extremely insightful from a not just from a historical point of view for its meanings, but also especially from an anthropological point of view, as also most of Hellenic mythology in its important historical development has showed us. So for Achilles it was enough to be vulnerable in a tiny portion of his body, to be killed by Paris, with the decisive complicity of the god Apollo, who wisely guided the Trojan's arrow right on that single target. Right? Achilles is not a figure like another. He's the prototype of a hero, right? Of something that goes beyond a competition between warriors. He is the unsurpassable one. He is the chosen one in a way. Everybody recognizes his value in that regard. So he is a step forward, a ladder above the others. And don't think that the Iliad is just so imaginative. Right here, we are talking about the memory of those psychopathic serial killers that Mycenaean warriors fundamentally were, right, as all warriors in their regard, that covered in metal, I don't know, landing on a shore somewhere in Greece could be easily mistaken by the local fishermen or peasant by semi-gods, right, and allowing them to build the lordships that they drew their strength from, and also because of this evident asymmetry, this evident fear, and towards this very capable fighters. So the story goes here. You see, with an archer, Paris, right, that is combining strength with a powerful and angry god, Apollo. The role of the first is very secondary, if not for his emblematic inconsistency as a warrior, which serves to make it even more evident to our eyes, as strong circumstances, such a vengeful god may allow even a coward to overpower a hero. And this is the greatest meaning that we can draw from here. Paris is not actor, right? He is really an incapable fighter. And he fights, in this case, also with an arrow, right? Very much like, even we can draw parallelisms with Germanic epics, where, after all, there is always the tragic destiny of the warrior. In many ways, this was known as far as the Near East as that also massively informed the Iliad in its heroic models. It's a shared realization, right? It's a lesson in humility for the powerful, which tells them not to consider themselves invincible and to watch their backs carefully. Nobody's safe. Everyone is vulnerable enough to be destroyed. This is the message that we constantly get from all the heroic sagas that we can find, from Greece to Rome to the Norse, and the realization that there is essentially a step forward that political and social system has to take in order to ensure a greater level of collective security that cannot be achieved just by a single one. And this is the history of our civil development. In many ways, we have explained, one of Schwerpunkt's light motives is exactly the recognition that warrior cultures, tribal cultures, always end destroyed by civilized states, because civilized states are way more powerful, right? They're not even just stronger; they're probably more powerful altogether than a primitive society that fundamentally pretends that the hero is always gonna make it. And this was not true even at the time, right? There is a few to celebrate about these wars. We have naturally described the tribal war for what it is. That is essentially a world dominated by criminal bands that exact tributes, and that is hush money in exchange for protection. A lawless society made just by individuals with no public culture but just a personalistic one. The warrior fights not for the community but for himself, for his prestige, his charisma. Right? What we have in civilized states now is something very different, that has taught us that model is weak and that this one is strong. This is not the time to talk about naturally this process evolved, but we cannot draw a specific line between the passage from one state to another. Many people say that our politics is going back to tribalism in a way. It is indeed true, but this is also the consequence of a too fast growth in economical importance of the masses that notoriously do not have an education or a civic culture of much of a sort, and are actually, and very often, the most cowardly of all the social components, and also the most violent, but also the most stupidly violent. It would be enough just to know Hellenic mythology to know what it is that brings to, in fact, and how you cannot fight a war without intelligence. Intelligence is by far and by norm what gives victory, right? And even here the exceptions teach us that we cannot ever be sure enough. And this is the message I would like to transmit today, or at least it's a memento, right? It's a reminder that nobody is beyond invulnerability, is beyond defeat. We can all be taken down, right? Easily, very easily. The myth that we're always gonna make it, that we, after all, we have the means, we have the resources, we have the understanding, we have the intelligence, is not to be given for granted. It's never to be given for granted, and it's exactly in the moments in which we have realized that we have been capable to produce a response to it that could be effective. Because when you are about to be destroyed, which is very often just a step away from it most of the times, you're not thinking about what doesn't work, you're not wondering, you're not daydreaming, you're work to find a solution, one that works for real, right? And even it's like a circle in a way, because when you found it, you say, oh, wow, now I can relax. At the moment you realize that it took quite of a, it had quite of a cost, right? It has a toll. And that's what we want to mostly derive away by human nature from, right? Our progress derives from this, right? But this is the lesson to be learned, that civilization doesn't stem from a positive development, but essentially to put patches of things that destroy you, right? The whole evolution has nothing to do with being the strongest, but just being the one who is capable of adapting to the circumstances, right? And this is what is very difficult by default for beings that essentially emerge from this random count, that this is the real deal, right? We fall in love with ourselves narcissistically, and we assume that there are certain features of ours that can never change, because after all, we were the ones who made the grade, right? We are the ones who developed the civilizations. We're the ones that at some point dominated the world. We're the ones that did it. We sooner. That's also kind of collective belief for which naturally people tend to equate themselves to the human groups they belong to, but it's actually not the case, right? As to be completely honest, it's not that the majority of people doesn't serve to society. Actually, they do, because they're the ones that produce the most. But individually, meant and what they can bring on it, but most of them, especially in terms of intelligence, are really useless, right? Most of them do not possess the structures, the tools to come up with a higher political culture that is capable to give a new boost and to be directed in an intelligent and rational manner, right? And the problem here is that the more our societies become complex, right, and the more this capacity is required, and at the same time, in fact, societies are ever less manageable in a way, at least in the way we used to, which costed much less, right? That's also the reaction that very often is sparked by change in this sense. I mean, it's not because people actually focus the problem. They remain fixed to what they have decided at a certain point was enough to know, to think like. And they're unavoidably incapable to cope with the situation. New generations usually are more updated, but once again, by themselves, on average, they're not going to make a natural leap forward or to come up with something substantial if there is really no structural thinking and commitment and scientific backing behind it. The myth that there is the good people that is always going to make it because it's pure, because it's good, because it's brave, it's a very unfortunate myth that came up, especially from a certain part of the Western world, and that unfortunately doesn't find any correspondence in the history of humanity. There is no evidence of that at all, right? There's not a people that has intrinsic capacities to solve problems by themselves. If anything, humans have that, but still in potential, and social, political groups change, cultures change, and especially they change with no regard for whatever people think about that, right? So that's also a declaration of weakness, if that is the case. I mean, denying change is a declaration of weakness, and a very important lesson that we can draw, historically speaking, is exactly this: that change comes. It's gradual. The world always changes. There are not big changes at a certain point specifically. The world that is also very often a didactic approximation. Of course, there are accelerations. For example, now we are facing a dramatic change. And it's often recognized in theory. That is to say, every person understands, just by looking at how we lived 100 years ago. I think even the kids born, 10 years ago, hopefully at least still realize that there's been such a change. But understanding how that change occurred, and understanding that this change is still happening and has been always happening, and that also historically might have not been in relative terms necessarily lower in previous eras, given the also the simplicity of those systems. So the fact that a specific change, even if apparently smaller, was a big deal for the times in terms literally of dead people or structural failures and so on. Is something we do not get habituated to, right? We are mostly beginning to draw this, inexistent ghosts that very often just betray, sort of Freudian complex towards actually what we see in ourselves in our own times. Rarely understand what the problem was back in the day. We skip, in this regard, with a blaming system, individual responsibility. We create figures to fear, so that we presume this emotionalistic or sensationalistic approach will do to spur civilization further. Unfortunately, it's not, right? And we could open now, but I will not do it, a huge digression about single specific examples from history, and especially our relation with the history of the 20th century, which, for example, in our political discourse is, at least in Europe, to tell the truth, because at least in the United States there is a debate still going on important issues up to the Civil War or even the American independence. But as far as Europe is concerned, it seems to me that the catastrophes of fascism and communism are told in ways that tend to confine the evil to that specific thing, and not recognizing that the evil, first of all, has not been eradicated at all, not even by the Second World War not even by the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's a broader disease that we still have at many levels in, demographic deficits, in capacity to realize what our next fundamentally is about. Probably the greatest failure of Europeans, broadly meant, is to recognize that they are Europeans, right? And what it means to be a European properly meant. I don't see this unity. I don't see this unity of intents, and this division is the consequence and the cause of weakness, right? Europe is very weak. This is very evident in our days, right? This is a weakness you can measure easily, even just on the markets, not to be seen in a militaristic, in a strategic perspective, right? It's obvious that there are tensions worldwide. Think about the role of Russia or Turkey, or these broader agitations that, of course, are kept under check by the state of things. I mean, it's not just a military response. It's first of all broader political reality. But as far as the United States are concerned, for example, in the last years, we've seen how there's been an ever greater distancing at some levels of within our Western world, that for whichever reasons have happened, I don't presume it's the Americans' fault, right? I think that it may be a problem in American as much as in European culture, which indeed we have many, we also share in common. But it's also, as I was saying before, the denial. It comes properly from a fear. It derives properly from the realization that there's not a step further that you have to take to be stronger, but a step backwards you have to take to avoid the temporary weakness in a dramatically short-sighted strategic culture, right? That responds just to the immediate problem and is incapable of seeing beyond. And the reason of this is laziness, right? It's in part ignorance, of course, but it's also this tendency of slowing down, of doing ever less, right? Because as if that was fundamentally a civilized value, right? I presume the value of civilization is to do always more, and this retraction that we can see many historical periods for similar reasons is probably tendential. There will be surely lots of studies coming up in the next decades about this topic. I personally, it's from 3 years that I study what I find a strikingly similar period in our history, at least in European history, that fundamentally shows similar patterns, and the reasons are a bit the same. But this definitely stems from it's like a big animal that is shooed, big, placid animals that looks at his fellow herd companion being devoured by a predator, and just stands a few meters away saying, well, I'm happy it's not me, right? That's the same thing. The predator thinks in a completely different way, and the world is always full of predators. We are all predators and preys at any time, and this is the point of this video. Now, there is not a single moment in which we can give up. We can put that money in bank and say, okay, we're done for. We can't be sure, we can't be safe. It takes really a few to be wiped out. History has showed this constantly. Throwing in the towel is the moment in which you leave the initiative to the enemy. It's the moment in which those who are observing you realize that you are morally inferior. Losing the initiative means you do not want to do it. You don't want to take the lead anymore. You are in a condition in which you just need to defend yourself. That's where you're vulnerable. That's where you leave room for others to improve, right? And worldwide, albeit there are no dramatic threats, right? I don't speak specifically of I would like you to get rid of any nationalistic or geopolitical mindset that unfortunately is so popular. The young generations that grown old with memes and other superficial interpretations of the world from this very culture that I'm describing right now at this point in our history. But to think of the fact that the disruption, first of all, arrives from a political and social point of view. Right? States are not monoliths that stay there until someone wipes them out with tanks and airplanes. Right? States can collapse by themselves pretty easily. And we had also, pretty good examples in Europe and the Mediterranean recently. So, for whichever reasons they happen, but that's a pretty good example of how, guys, that's next door, right? It's not. It's actually our backyard or even our home, right? As far as the Ukraine is concerned, for example, or even Belarus. These are situations that need to be analyzed carefully. If the mindset is just, those are just the weird Eastern European countries where every once in a while there's a massive regime change, you have already lost as a Westerner, as a European, as a civilized human being, right? You deny a democratic culture, you deny a historical knowledge, and the interesting thing is that you can do it, but other people will not, and other people will come over you, and it will crush you at some point, because you have been weak not to act, and not to understand, and not to make that effort, right? Achilles' example is definitely true, right? And I often spoke, maybe I'm a bit biased on this, but on the prejudice that we have towards tyranny. But even here, the concept of tyranny in the sense it's usually portrayed, where we often shout towards in the West. Instead, I see a lot of tyranny elsewhere, right? It's still within ourselves, but in different forms. The caveat that the attention to safety of modern post-industrial societies is not characterized by the arrogance of the strongest, willing to avenge the slightest offense with a non-commensurate use of his own strength, because that is what an equivocal affirmation of one's right to dominate, but if anything, from the opposite attitude. First of all, the conviction of a condition of irremediable frailty and absolute vulnerability. This is what our societies, by giving up the initiative, have turned into. Right? It's difficult to talk openly about political examples relatively to this, but just to be quite clear, do you think that in the last 20 years Westerners have increased or decreased their interest towards the rest of the world? Well, in my opinion, it seems to me that this interest has literally sunk in ways that, historically speaking, we never had. Right? Ever since we created global scale empires, right, our attention was actually the idea up to the mid 20th century. We were still thinking we are the ones who manage the world. Who does think this anymore? Right? It's the same people who lived at the time live today. The same people who believed that at the time live today. In part, do you understand what has happening here from a moral point of view? I mean, the subtlety of this change, of this perspective. Just think on a global scale, in terms of markets, of policies, of different types of military policies, of economical policy, how much the sudden reverse. It's not just a change, it's like the reverse. It's this enclosing yourself into a shell has damaged the West, like in terms of just billions of dollars. Not just naturally by contrast at the hand of someone, but literally because of what we have given up willingly on our own. And here we're not talking about, retreating from one country that we invaded or that we had sent troops to aid. Here we're talking about a broader asset of interests and a net of broader connections, of clienteles, of shared interests that could be our path for constructing a more integrated control together with the rest of the world, and is that what we have today? Right? It's not that other countries out there are faring well. There is not a big enemy that will dominate us, like during the Cold War. China is notoriously a paper tiger. They do not have absolutely the capacities to compete, I don't know, with the United States at a global level. They're doing much and far worse in many ways, but, at some point we'll have to talk about it. But it's also the same impression, for example, the idea that, after all, if there is a thug out there that claims that his country has to restore an imperialistic policy, our first attitude is not to laugh at it, but starting saying, that bitch, I hate him, right? He's just a monster, and, already being in a defensivistic attitude, and hating, and at the end of the day, doing nothing about it. This is where we have our greatest weakness, because it's as if the playground, the battleground, was shifted within our own selves. The nature of our society is such that any Paris, just as we have seen with Achilles' killing, does not even need the help of a god Apollo to hurt it. Right? Apollo could be, I don't know, the communist bloc during the Cold War. There you had in the Iliad, you have fundamentally this. I mean, Paris is not just a random guy that arrives there with a bow and strikes Achilles in his it's lethal, literally vulnerable spot. There was a divine power behind that, and that divine power is a totalizing force that very often is the one existing in major conflicts, in major clashes. Here there is none of that. At the moment, we do not... It's embarrassing. I mean, we could do so much because there is no concrete enemy that faces us today. All countries that allegedly oppose the West are ridiculous. They do not have the money for any military capability of major scale, right? Just they would never use nuclear weapons, unless they attacked on their own soil. Nobody cares for that. There are no bases at the moment for any kind of conflict of that intensity. This would be the best moment to invest worldwide and to strengthen our capacity, also through a military mean, which doesn't mean invading another country, but just aiding, I don't know, democracy. For example, stabilizing certain specific strategical areas, not leaving countries on their own. In fact, for others to arrive there and to start acting instead, actively, in fact, against us. It's one of the easiest moments by historical standards, right? The real problem of this all is us, right? It's the fact that a force in the past could be required at a much higher level, right? That people maybe were more, say, easier to handle in a certain sense, But we must understand why today they're not, right? The fact that there is not an absolute scale of governability that says, okay, well, at a time in history, this people is easy to govern and this other is not, right? Today we have an opulent society where everybody could simply say, okay, well, I'll give you the $10 to accomplish something, to just do it and to do something big. In our mass society, it would be very easy. This is not happening. There is not specifically a political will, but not even a political vision or culture that recognizes this. Right? On the contrary, we are inwardly behaving. So much as we're saying that any Paris, even without any strong force behind it, can cause important damage. And typical in this sense, as you understand, is the terroristic threat that can be implemented. And this is an example in Europe today, also abroad, unfortunately, most in Western countries, but not only. I mean, many other countries are basically being targeted at so different levels. But you can see even just more distant history, black or red terrorism during the 1970s, the 1980s. Those are very hard times as well for that show the important damage that terrorism could do. But that terrorism, as this one, is carried out by third-rate intellects with laughable means that are not even particularly difficult to obtain, only if one has the desire and the patience to frequent a criminal undergrowth a little, right? I don't know if you ever thought about this, but what do you think is the actual military control of our states in our countries, in our societies, right? This is a good example that to prove what vulnerability concretely is. States, as we were saying before, are not monolithical entities that manifest everywhere. That if you want to kill someone on the street, you can do it tomorrow, quite easily. You can make a bloodbath. Who's gonna stop you before you carry that out, right? And we can tell that another person will not do just the same, right? This is not a broad, structural hyper-intelligence or dangerous system that we find behind. Unfortunately, those exist, but at the same time, unfortunately, they do not operate against us yet, right? Some of the most dangerous terroristic organizations in the world are not even known by the average Westerner, right? If I tell you what's the most dangerous terroristic group in the world, most people wouldn't even know who is this, right? Never heard it. Most people would say, I don't know, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, this thing. Very far from that, guys. Very far from that. And this is the problem, that we are scared, we are shied away, we are triggered, we are inflamed by literally imbeciles. There are either, it's mostly identitaristic behavior. That means to say, thinking that in your mind, faking that you are something and doing nothing in the world at the same time. This is exactly how most people also vent like on the internet, or they at least daydream in some ways, and they revealed that they are product of that mass society that we were saying before. So it's even normal, right? You cannot expect the world at this point to have become of highly intellectually developed people that can always make interesting points, or bring on the fore new ideas, innovative concepts, and so on. But that's not even what we need. Sometimes all what we need is to go back, for example, what we have already produced as a civilization, to read a bunch of works, to study them, hopefully, to grow a bit of a structured critical capacity. That's it, right? To know what you're talking about, right? An important part of this process is exactly knowing what you're talking about, having a rational capacity to frame it, to define it, at least knowing how it operates with other issues, and then you start from that. Most people replace that with fantasy, right? They skip simply cause-effect relations, elementary logic, and so they add to this broader difficulty. This is not to say that governing our world is easy, right? Hell, it's never been. Now it's even worse, in a way. But as we also have said, in proportion, the greater problem seems that in proportion to our resources, we're investing an ever smaller part of them in the enterprise. I mean, there is no comparison with, I don't know, the ancient world of medieval world, where everything was produced, basically was immediately consumed, because it was a constant threat, and you had to do it. It was a minimal growth, right? Today, there is a hell of a growth. Still, there is especially a hell of deposited wealth that is not invested, or at least it is, but in very short terms. Enterprises, let's say, that even with that material wealth cannot build a moral force and intellectual capacity to formulate a strategic culture to know where to invest them more effectively, right? We are taking it very, very passively, very fatalistically also. More generally, a sophisticated and interdependent system like ours has a very precarious balance, right? Destabilizing it in this sense is easy. And the consequences of this feedback are unpredictable, right? The response that a node of the system produces in the face of the shock that has hit another, which perhaps only an echo has reached it, in fact, is not easily predictable. It can stem the damage by friction or by biological reaction, as it can amplify it or transform it and transmit it still to other nodes. This has always been true historically, but now the net is much more complex. So you have way more difficulties to know exactly where the crisis will break out. Right? There are many more possibilities. It's a much more difficult system to sort out, mathematically speaking. Right? You can never sort it out. Right? You cannot sort out, a political social system, but by an equation, it's impossible. So you need that, strategic culture to know how to address the problems as they come, but also partially being able to predict them, or to and to avoid them as a consequence. But once again, this is not something you build from one day to another. You need an entire generation of competent people, of at least a part of society that really knows its business pretty well under this regard, that builds an awareness around it, creates the public awareness of the problem, of the scale of the problem, so that at a political level there can be more understanding and participation to solving the problem as it is. Fake news, if you wonder why they have had this dramatic impact today, it's especially in past years, it's because they were trying to avoid exactly this. We're trying to push public opinion in the opposite direction of what it's needed for problem solving. As a consequence, though, in the immediate, in present times, it seems that the attitude towards fake news has changed. There's definitely greater awareness, but the way we have started to cope with fake news, it's not, unfortunately, a critical skill, capacity to recognize them one another, but just to label what the narratives that you've heard about them have been, and not knowing why they're wrong, and just refusing them in total, and even cutting, away in the process important, not just, in fact, denying yourself the development of an actual critical capacity, which is the most important thing, but even sacrificing, cutting away, and disowning certain important parts of your culture, also of legitimate doubt, or certain expressions or phrases or even words. And this is not a good sign, because this is a sclerotization of thought. It's the increase of a bipolar dichotomy, right? Bipolarism doesn't quite exist, right? It's a term we mostly use to simplify certain realities, but at least towards certain reactions we can see how the two bubbles or the areas of these discussions have ever more isolated, and essentially also they're probably running out of steam as far as the concern, the commitment really is, right? There is this sense, oh, I don't want to even participate to that debate because it's boring, right? Because it can turn against me, or maybe it's not important. Surely real life is another thing, and that is also important to recognize, and that's actually the point we're making. But at the same time, there is also the realization that the lack of realization that real life is really influenced by people who reason like that. Because you can even, switch off your iPhone, or quit in the computer, and so on. But if there is someone who still believes in that stuff in real life, you will meet them in the street, and it's not just an internet thing, right? It's not just a social network problem. It's in part that, but it does really affect reality, and it might arrive a time which it will be too late, right? I often say how scary it is to see, especially on history videos on YouTube, that this overwhelming amount of comments and especially also of likes that get certain simplistic statements, but that are not just simplistic, but that are specifically oriented in a political sense, for which you realize that there is a huge consensus behind, but that to which there is apparently also no counter argument. But more especially if you have gone beyond that specific point, that there is no even even a dialectical capacity anymore to address and to debunk, to explain why it's not the case, why the thing is wrong, because on base of rational scientific evidence, it's really wrong. It doesn't work like that, right? It doesn't mean you have the truth, but you definitely know that doesn't work. That is not correct. 2 + 2 doesn't make 5, right? But if you make people believe that 2 + 2 is 5, you will have an entire generation of people that will take this huge assets to re-educate, and that will even to make them state that 2 + 2 is 4, but that they will not. They will also develop a counter culture, because the means that you need to use to teach them that 2 + 2 is 4 is, I don't know, maybe are going to be deemed as anti-democratic, to go against their personal beliefs, or to that they're positive, they're fascist, or whatever, right? This is the great problem we're addressing, and now we have abandoned the naive. That's mostly from the 2010s, right? The naive exposure to fake news and to this permeability of conspiracy theories. Now we're entering in the ideologically structured dichotomy that is sclerotizing, and it's more difficult to get rid of, right? And it's difficult also for there are also demographic reasons that would be interesting to tell. There is, however, a broader chronological spectrum of unaddressed issues that brought to the construction of these beliefs. That's why also historical awareness is so important, because it's not that these beliefs are born today. Everything comes from the before, right? As I was saying before, it's not that World War II has stopped for example, the cognitive processes for which, totalitarianisms were capable of indoctrinating people. Help, sometimes it wasn't even enough to raise entire countries to the ground in order to educate democratically. And that's also, in fact, not even to be expected, as a matter of fact. It's not that if you bomb a country, those will become democratic people, right? Those are probably going to get worse, especially if their background didn't know much of democracy before. But this is something that even a child understands. I mean, we have this. This is exactly the point. We have given this overwhelming importance and confidence to our own capacities to civilize others. Civilization is not something that grows on trees randomly. You can distribute to people and they will use it. If there is no background, you have to work hard to build something, and this hard work is not there anymore. We have stopped to believe, to understand how important it was. And even, for example, what happened after World War II, as far as Cold War is concerned, well, if you study it, there were good people there that carried out pretty amazing things and pulled it off to avoid to annihilate each other. And it's fascinating as the democratic world has accomplished that, but also, the dignity of human intelligence actually showed interesting results even in those places that didn't have much of a democratic culture. So there is really a common language we can speak, right? This idea of enclosing ourselves for fear is regressing to those non-democratic realities. This is also the other point we're doing now, right? That a strategic culture requires necessarily a civic education. It's what we were saying before about tribes and states. States do not remain states forever. If you go back to a tribalistic culture, you're damaging your intelligence capacities to educate people to use your military mean. That's why, for example, I don't like at all this despicable stuff of considering your military warriors. It's an insult to any person who has an actual respect to our military institutions and history and traditions. We are citizen soldiers. We're not warriors. Warriors are long rotten and buried under our feet. Thank God for that. We are something way better that we have earned over time by, dying, by fighting against sometimes ourselves, because we all stem from that tribal reality. And what do we want to do? We want to go back to it. That's how disoriented our society is. This point. And a common mistake that is made by reasoning about security or by programming its policies is in fact structural. This is what we forgot. It's not that you roll the dice, you have a solution. You have to work structurally for it. This is a mistake that our ancestors, grappling with a simpler, perhaps wiser world, did not make. Right? There is a great difference between intelligence and wisdom. Right? You can, of course, understand that a very complex strategical thought was not possible in Achilles' times. Right? But, of course, let aside it probably didn't exist, but, those times did exist. There was an important improvement, right? Talking about modern strategy, yeah, it's difficult. It's something you can see maybe from Pyrrhus onwards, right? Before it wasn't like that. It was a simpler way of making it, in the concept of command, right? In the idea of having a set of, an articulate system with separate, specialized reality. It's something that emerged, I don't know, from, in the West at least, from the Persian Wars, right? It took time. And our ancestors had definitely the excuse of their context, their background. We do not have, because what we have produced is here on paper or on screen to read. Ignorance is not justified by the slightest. There is nothing, honorable, nothing admirable, nothing praiseable about saying, I'm a person in 2020 and I don't inform myself because I don't need it, or I do not need either a humanistic or scientific education because you're not a complete individual. You're not a useful element of society. There's no pride in absolute freedom. Right? We have to make it very clear, and it's very embarrassing, in fact, even how important political philosophies and theories in our culture are being bent to transform into something that they denied themselves, right? No surprise that sometimes we even change the semantic meaning of words with a very precise etymology, or even ban the ones that we do not like, because this has become to attack even the way we express our thoughts, right? That, or at least this is something that we have done to ourselves. So once again, it's even worse. It's not that there is an evil dictator that told us to do it, under threat of annihilation from the other side of the world. We're doing it to ourselves. That's our level of weakness. But the concept of security is important here, because we're talking, as we were saying before, of our everyday life, of things that do not happen just with screens. We are bombarded with news at the point we even don't care anymore. We say, okay, I receive 500 news a day, but my reality is the one I see around me. So there is an evident divide. Well, this is a problem also. There is a certain way of information, and that should also be mostly an autonomous thing, not just a passive one. But specifically, when we read of a terrorist attack, as it could be so close to, I don't know, the other week there was Vienna. I don't know. That's a place where normally go on vacation. They attacked the same place where I went to eat often. The question is, damn, I mean, that could be me. That's my life. That's my area. That's my where the world that I consider as a home, right? So it's not a fiction. It's not something I can't confuse with a documentary, things that have happened in the past. There's something that happens now, and it happens for a reason. So security strategies are very complex business that naturally the common people cannot and probably should even not deal with at a certain level, but the awareness that somebody at least has to work for them should be much more stimulated. In other words, consider that there are not as many certainties there are aspects of people's lives. I can't say, I don't know, I can't segment, I can't separate all the specific threats that can happen to me, right? All the specific accidents, even random ones that can happen to me, and say, okay, well, then I will consider them individually as a statistic, right? There is I can't sectorialize the solution of each of them. There is only one aspect of people's lives and security, right, to be protected with a single strategy in turn, which also makes use, of course, of diversified tools, but provides a unitary response. Military culture, as you understand, passes very importantly through this, because there is a principle of unity of command and effectiveness that passes not from a separation, from an analysis, a mere analysis, but properly to carry out the thing, and that requires a specific practice, a specific experience, a specific culture, specific education, a specific capacity. That is to say, you cannot have just 500 people in one country that each of them study a single aspect about terrorism in their own country, but you do not have a police unit that is able to intervene and to shoot down a terrorist during an attack, right? I won't get myself started automatically as usual by saying how we have denied, and this is probably one of the most important cultural faults of our society, that the constant relation between politics and the exercise of violence in a positive sense as well as a negative one, of course. The fact that there is no just dialogue, there is no just easy, mild manners. There is also, you need something. There is a specific motivation for it. You choose your instruments, but at a certain point, you may run out of option. You cannot, start automatically from principle that solution has to be just one, or in just one way, right? First of all, because threats always change, so simply by definition there can't be that. But you can even castrate yourself by saying I will not use this thing because it's evil, and also making a great disfavor to your political culture, stating so violence is evil. So what about this? The example I always point out: how do you shoot down a suspect, but how do you get rid of a totalitarian regime, right? Are you denying, as a Westerner, the value of resistance, which is a violent thing, largely, and not by evil, but for reality? I mean, Gandhi, if he had rifles, he would have used them, right? He just acted in the only way he could at that moment. But there is a regime that is actively slaughtering people. What do you do? Do you ask, please, they can't stop? Right? How do you think it works? How many options do you think you have? How much time do you want to waste? You have to make your choice. I'm not saying you must use violence, but the point is you have to contemplate it, at least if you are a civically responsible person, if you actually have a democratic culture. Because most of our democracies were born out of violence. And violence by itself, always remember it, does not have any good or evil nature. Only the political action that makes it follow is to be criticized positively or negatively for it. But violence is a pure instrument. There is no evil in violence, as there is no good in violence. It's just violence. And that's how it works. It's just an instrument. People do things. Violence is something that is carried out by people. It's not something that carries out by itself. Right? This may sound banal, but it's also something that I don't see much of. Very often people say, "Oh well, we shouldn't use violence." Then there's not much complaint when we shoot down a terrorist because it's threatening someone's life. Which is a good example of how there is really a gap, an important discrepancy between what people say and think in a certain context and what they let happen and normally is carried out also by political will in order to solve some problems. But this could be extended to many other points, right? To be dogmatic about certain specific actions, like, making war is wrong, but making a certain economical policy is not. Or at least nobody gets so much shocked by it as violence. It's not that if you kill 1,000 people in a bombardment, it's worse than you kill 1,000 people by cutting the export of certain dairy products, because these people are dying, right, in different ways, but they're still, if you at least value people's lives, that unfortunately also is another thing that, unfortunately, people's lives has a price, right, on Earth, at least. This is the case, and it's always been, unfortunately. But that's exactly the problem. Why are you weakening yourself by denying a potential opportunity to change things for the better, and that is not acting when you could, and saving actually people's lives. You're not letting others killing them, because also people do not die by themselves, or at least they could. I mean, as catastrophes happen, but normally humans are also capable of messing themselves up without climate change or or pandemics. I mean, or at least they can't with pandemics, unfortunately, as well as we're seeing now. But the problem is, there is always in this sense a responsibility, right? Even for climate change, of course. But nothing is random. Nothing stops with okay, I decide that this is it. I don't need to do anything else about it. You're done. You're giving up. You're leaving the initiative to the enemy. There's always someone who's going to exploit that, and you're going to lose. Naturally, nobody can work all the time in this regard, but there is a chance to improve, and this chance is largely being ignored. There is no economic security, safety in the workplace, security from terrorism or common crime. There is a body, our own, with its physical and intangible expressions, and the threats that are directed against it, and that ultimately injure the body itself. Right, and this doesn't have to pass necessarily through direct violence or, let's say, voluntary attack, but it can happen simply by, things happen and you're dying day after day, aren't you? Right? That's what we are doomed to do. And so everything adds up to that. And that's in part a compromise, naturally, that we carry out to say, okay, well, we live according to certain standards that for now are, pretty clear, also pretty well suited to our own societies. If you think about human rights in general, I mean, we're doing a fairly good job altogether. But that is not sufficient by itself, because changes can overwhelm that quite quickly, right? It's not human rights are, people have right to everything all the time, or they can't be actually given that thing all the time. I think world history shows dramatically, even to our day, that there's just a name, also a utopistic dimension to this. Like, there are people that are even actively fighting against human rights that is their own, right? So that's also another political culture you have to take into consideration. It doesn't work with them, or at least it may work, but not given the specific, contingency on which we have to work otherwise. So all these problems, right, are create each on their own fears, and therefore altogether fear in an absolute and totalizing sense. Just imagine all the problems that you have currently, and sense the fact, as we all do, that it's not that you get worried by different things at once. I mean, usually, because also they vary in intensity, but altogether there's a weight, there's a burden that you carry on every day, right? So it's not easy to live, of course, but there is specifically a fear that I presume we all had at a certain point, I don't know, to get into a terrorist attack, into an accident, into, I don't know, getting sick and all this stuff. That is something we cope with, not just individually, but also we find solutions collectively. That is, I cannot stop terrorist attack on my own. I cannot stop a pandemic on their own. There has to be a generalized consent and an action and direction and unity of intents, right? Because otherwise we fail unavoidably, right? And a military culture is a bit the epitomization of that, meaning that the the greatest concept of unity in leadership and in command, in fact, in an organization, passes through the military hierarchy, through command. Why? Because the military instrument copes with the greatest fear of all. Right? He who comes with the greatest force you can unleash to annihilate you. And I fear in this sense that our society is not just strategically literate, but also as a consequence, unavoidably indisciplined, narrow-minded, sclerotized, passive, all things that the military makes the other way around. Not that unfortunately the military is always effective, but it's surely on average one of the most efficient, parts of our society, because as others that cope with emergencies and so on, because they realize by directly what the deal is in those circumstances. Why is discipline is important, right? All of this anti-military attitude, philosophy. One thing is being anti-militaristic. One thing is, to be specifically saying, okay, there shouldn't be any war ever. Why? Right? Those are two very different things. Right? It's not that people like wars and they normally fight them just for fun, or just because there is the evil guy at the top that decides to send send the young people to that. Because societies do not work like that. There is a specific political consensus, and not even in a dictatorship you're actually sent to war if you do not want to. Like, you always have an option, you always have a power, and especially collectively speaking, society has a power. I mean, all the totalitarianisms we see historically are systems that worked consensually, right? That is to say, resistance to that was minimal. Otherwise, how do you think you can actually rule a country? Just, pointed a bayonet to everybody's back? It doesn't work like that, right? No human system has ever worked had no power on earth has ever had that specific capacity, but not even by the slightest. So that's also another very idiotic prejudice that, in fact, is very often coupled with this pacifistic ideas, that is, fundamentally, you should never use violence whatsoever. Yes, okay, so we should have never freed Europe from fascism, for that matter. Or, Eastern Europe should have not been freed from the Soviet Union. But it's fine, right? Why using violence after all, right? As we were saying before, also, it's not that open violence is necessarily worse than, sanctions of other kind. When people start starving to death or killing each other, right? So everything has a consequence, and if you do not have a specific education, you cannot understand what the implications of that are. That is to say, what the consequence. Think about strategic analysis, right? That's a very difficult thing. It's not that every random person can say what will happen to a country when you make a rollback. That requires an enormous responsibility, but once again, that's no excuse for crossing that out of the list. At the same time, it's also no excuse to remain inept and deliberately becoming more ignorant about the world and what can happen to it, because it's difficult, right? It's a loser's mindset. It doesn't serve anybody, and especially it doesn't serve you. On the contrary, it actually advantages other people who know how, in fact, actually how to exploit the thing. So fear helps, in its totality, to understand why, in terms of security, specifically, the subjectivity of perception prevails, right? Because it's instinctual. Right. In fact, beyond these statistics on this or that social threat, that once again we cannot simply conceive in a separate fashion, right? And that's also what. Don't think that the scientific, the academic world is so open-minded about the actual meaning of these works. But there is unfortunately also in there a great passivity to simply say, okay, we have to write something with every comma in the precise place, but who cares if it's something that serves a community, or it has a meaning, or it talks with other, it can be connected to other fields, or can be put to practical use, right? So if the social fear ceiling is high, any positive excellences will also come into the collective perception to align with the average. This is it, right? We highly risk to, and we are seeing it. For example, in the historical field, it's pretty common now, right? Now, there is an ever greater political, agenda in certain historical sectors that it's not that they had saint particularly in portraying a wrong picture of certain realities. On the contrary, now there are people who exchange history for making political as an excuse to make political propaganda and actually obscuring scientific evidence, which is a very different thing from saying, okay, well, history is political by a certain degree. By a certain degree, but it shouldn't exceed the functions of history, broadly meant. And the key here, once again, is low moral, right? People allow that to happen. It's not something we have to address just by criticizing and saying, okay, we can't do anything about that. We should denounce it. We should fight against it. A society or an army, which is the same thing, right, with high morale, will have such a low ceiling of fear that will tend to minimize threats, right? Also, sometimes underestimating them. But this is exactly the point, that you have to give a balance to this. You have to accept that there are certain standards you have to fix, and you have for the given moment, but also to be willing to change depending on the situation, to make those who are going to exploit your potential weaknesses that they're not going to have a room in this. Right? You can't be infinitely tolerant, but also you can't be infinitely intolerant, because this will cause an unbalance. Right? Whoever tends towards the extreme by default doesn't have great fortune, historical, and generally speaking doesn't have a great reason at the moment. And I think history is a pretty good example of how those who are in charge and that are technically placed in that position by a system that selected them, their essentially moral capacities, broadly meant, so also usually rationality, but not just that. Also high morale, broadly meant, constantly negotiate, right? There can't be a society, a civilization that doesn't negotiate, that doesn't recognize this impending threat that can derive, also can produce, can materialize in the future, just staying there and waiting for the next threat to happen, or simply thinking that that time will not be necessary to cope with the new problems that might give them more strength to minimize the threat. Historically, you see also declining powers decline, not just because of not because morals are very important, but they're not the cause of a fall from a pre-condition, right? Theoretically, every society can fall from a moment to another. It's very easy. The moral forces are the ones that change the quickest at any time. So even in them searching for in them deep roots, right, it can be useful as long as this serves to to boost them at the moment, to refine, to fix them as long as they're still standing. But there can be like an avalanche effect or domino effect that makes them, crumble altogether for a specific reason that you didn't necessarily address, or that you kept addressing but nobody actually cared for it, and so that you didn't find a concrete value for or a force from your own side to put to practical use. Must also be considered a further perverse effect that acts as a multiplier of threats. If in fact the perception of collective security is low at the moment, the result is a high social recklessness, right? A day-to-day living without projects and strategies, a pernicious abandoning oneself to insecurity. Look at our societies right now. Are we reasoning in time of crisis with an expectation for the future? That is something that the masses may or may not have. Usually they don't now. I think we are reasoning now what will happen, I don't know, in a few months or next year, because that's fundamentally what we care about. But those who govern us, or at least those who are deputed to find a solution in that sense, do really invest more than much in a long-term strategy. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that you can actually predict what will happen, but do we actually store enough plans and resources for actually coping with possible threats and problems? Right? It's obvious that there is always a delay, but once that the problem has been evidenced, why is it so difficult to further, think that, that we're still in time to do more? That's also laziness. That's also giving up the initiative. That's also lowering the community's morale and having ever less resources for the future. So that from alarm to alarm, from fibrillation to fibrillation, society becomes mithridatized, starts being paranoid and hardens, right? It sclerotizes. It loses the sense of the common good, of collective interest, of shared reasoning, withdrawing into all what remains, the clan, the family themselves. That's tribalism. That's exactly why certain civilizations didn't make it and others did, because some were tribal. They didn't have the first and foremost intellectual capacity, the resources that is all connected to that, to take a further step. Why can't you find that Hannibal in the Middle Ages, largely? It's because there weren't. It was plenty of them, but they didn't have enough resources most of the times to centralize enough to have that specific education and upbringing and vision and possibility. And actually, as we all know, in tribal societies, individuals perform pretty damn well. It's at a collective level that they suck pretty badly, and that's why they lose. And that's why tribes from most of the earth has been literally wiped out. It wasn't nice, right? It didn't happen tenderly most of the times. In the sense, we literally wiped them out. Also because they didn't like very much the idea of changing their life. So there is a specific risk inherent to the abandonment of your own responsibility. In thinking that once that you're hit, what you have to do most of the time is just, to be repulsed. That means that you have not stood your ground. That means that you have given up an opportunity to show your enemy that you can still strike back, so that he may as well stop. Instead, the enemy will continue. And at a certain point, you may be too weak to actually do anything about it. This is the real problem. That's what security is, right? Nobody is secure. Nobody will ever be. And it's only through that awareness that we can move and we can avoid being destroyed. At least we have to have more chances, right, to remain, to stay alive, to go on, right, to pull the cart again, because it's either you or the other, and whatever as blended as the situation is, the more confusing it becomes. So as we were saying, once this, I don't know, there were two neighboring tribes, they hated each other guts, they clashed against each, but at least it's their neighbors, they know who they are. In this society, if you do not have a sound understanding cultivated in years of inquiry, of information, of education, you can hardly even understand who's who, and therefore you're even more vulnerable. You will not, I presume most people that live in most times in history, but especially in this zone, just live their lives without actually understanding much about the world, the life they lived. I mean, I think to me this is pretty evident. What are average people mostly concerned with? Maybe paying the rent, or being entertained, having that moment at the end of the week in which they can relax and watch a movie, or to get a girlfriend, to treat the problems of starting a family, of raising kids. But okay, that's also something that requires an important management, right? And most people also probably are not very good at it, as unfortunately lots of problems exist at these levels too. But as far as understanding maybe the constitution of the state where you live, or the country for what it is, or its past, why certain dynamics are in one and another, why the rest of the world intervenes in your life, and what's behind it. Everything seems to be left to conspiracy theories in a way or another, to simplistic interpretations at least. That is, okay, if I can't find a better solution, I will simply go on with this cliche until I die, because that will show I maintain my own opinion. Yes, but you lost in the meanwhile. And you also made lose the people that maybe expected something from you, like your children, for example. You actually perpetuated the problem of not making them understand what this world was really about. Right. Presenting, I presume rising a new adult it's not just about life choices and the essentials of life is tough and can be sad and dramatic. We need also that kind of negative thing. We have to tell that not everything is going to go well. Unfortunately, also one of the important problems today is exactly this one. We have said, okay, everything is always going to be well. Then it goes bad, and people do not have the capacity to accept it. Why are all these psychiatric problems arising, also especially among young people? Because we have promised them something false, right? Even in here, there is a specific generational problem. I may even place myself exactly into this trend as for when I was a kid, considering present times, how things have, how the things went. I fortunately say that I don't have specific problems at the moment, never had in my life. But it's evident that, the morale can be high, especially when you're young. You tend to have more resources to spend, but it's not such a comforting picture, right? You don't wake up in the morning and say, what a beautiful moment. That's a matter of perspective. You can also learn how to act on your moral. But once again, it's a balance. It's realizing, okay, you can't be too optimistic, you can't be too pessimistic. Just be real, right? Just work to sort out what the problem is, right? That's a good start. And there is no other solution, you see. So, in this sense, also taking advantage of Achilles' unfortunate destiny, one can understand the limits of a concept of security understood as invulnerability. Too many exposed and sensitive points to intervene, protecting them all, defeating all fears, right? It's impossible, right? The myth of invulnerability, unfortunately, does belong to those cultures who are too used to happy endings, who tend to embellish maybe the situation, or to polarize or to simplify the political debate. It's not necessarily that peoples that have it worse are actually better in understanding that, but as far as moral forces are concerned, maybe those people will be boosted to come out of that misery more effectively, right? And I must say that also Western society, all in all, it's good, right? I don't lament myself. I make these videos often criticizing it by saying, the West, because there is also this narrative, right? The West now is garbage. We've lost everything, old values. It's not true. There's a path. We're going along. We make mistakes, maybe too many at a point, but who doesn't? And also in times of crisis, actually it seems we do work pretty well. But it also seems that, however, we are not thinking too much of the future in the scale. You see, the future has yet to come. So we don't actually know how it could be, right? By now we could have bet on it and said, okay, well, for now it went well enough. But we couldn't tell, 10 years ago. Maybe 10 years ago we would have shocked how things would have turned. But the point is that not necessarily in another 10 years things will always go well, because we are the West, whatever it means. And we have to plan that. And it doesn't seem, I repeat it, at least according to me, it doesn't seem to me there is much planning in that regard. There is no major, fortunately maybe, there is no major pushing factor. But the pushing factor also creates attrition and a crisis. So that's also what we try to avoid. So people's morals in the process must be kept up in reserve. And as we were saying before, you don't create that from a day to another. More useful, if its eccentricity at least is accepted, is the definition of freedom to act undisturbed. That is, to make decisions and carry out actions according to autonomous processes, not influenced by external threats, right? Where the concept of security as invulnerability translates into the late and inane feeling of leaks, that of the faculty to act lends itself instead to the search for active and preventive ways. Because it radically changes perspective, makes you think differently, forces you to have an overall and systemic conception of security, favoring synergies and economies in the use of resources. In short, it forces you to act strategically, to depute a certain amount of your resources to solve that specific problem in those specific terms, and having a complex vision of the world. And as you understand, as we were also recalling before, this does not depend on individuals. Of course, this positive conception of security prevails over the other, right? It is a high political design. We don't decide this thing, you and me, right? Individually, but already together we can do better, right? It's just that I think that this is not a time and even place that can produce such strategic culture, this high political design, this specific capacity or education. I don't see it. I don't see the resources. I don't see the single people that can carry it out. We can't accept the thing fatalistically unless we want disasters to take place. And I would like to expand on the various, say, maybe the various fields from which this response could come from, but that's even more difficult specifically to want. Right? Just remember that nobody is invulnerable. There is not, and that war in strategic thinking is specifically based on putting the adversary not into necessarily an intrinsic state, but also in a position from which you can defeat him, right? And this happens historically by naturally spotting the weakest point, if you want, but also spotting essentially even what is the center of this base. If the center of this base is what is deputed to find a solution is weak, the enemy will realize it immediately, because we are much more sensible to moral forces than we are to technical realities. We can immediately spot it, which in fact are the latter being way less important also in warfare than the first ones. It's very easy to spot a morally weak person. It's very easy to spot who's going to break. It's very easy to spot who you're simply going to push through and it's going to collapse. And it often comes exactly in those moments of inaction, those moments in which the person seems to be frozen, to not to be producing too much. And that's why I'm worried about the West, also largely about the rest of the world in that sense, but since I presume that the West can provide solutions for an important part of the world, that it's not just itself, and the rest of the world having problems, and I mean serious ones, also within themselves in the same way, but they're not going to help particularly also the West in its own regard, and that mostly seek also to damage it for its own advantage. Well, the point is, watch out. Right? Just know that you're not secure. That what you have, what you're used to live like every day, is not to be given for granted. You will not have it forever. Those who will come after you will not have it forever. There will be a moment of change. Right? At least the same thing. It's not necessarily going to be worse, but it will require new challenges to face. And so the threat that those challenges will pose must find someone who is capable of coping with them. And now we're defenseless, largely. And as far as we have seen from the outer world, that as we have seen is not particularly advanced either in this regard. Well, we're dramatically exposed. Right? If fake news were they were probably one of the most effective means historically found for offense, in a way, because they're pretty damn cheap. You can really make an enormous damage to very few, and you put more than that. It's not just a matter of controlling them. It's how do you tell a society that is wrong? I mean, what's the authority that is going to take the responsibility to say to, I don't know, half of a country's electorate, you're a bunch of idiots because you believe in this thing, so you don't even know what what the world is about, and that's something that we need to do at a point. And I said half, meaning not that there is a half of the people is right and the other is wrong, but at least one maybe is doing nothing, the other is actively going against a specific interest. Right? There's surely a third way, because I don't see in any country at the moment any specific political culture, party, or tendency of enlightened people, right? You can't say just between left and right, between liberals and conservatives. At this point now, this side has a good point, right? They have really gotten what's the problem right now. They have a plan. They can't see through what will happen. No, it's mostly like staying afloat, maintaining certain amount of power that is necessary just for that extra more, but even there without no much political vision. We've seen, in fact, important changes even in political culture recently because of that. We are already arrived at the point of political consequences that have gone beyond the stasis, right? There is somebody who has taken it to the next step, and it's a horrible one, by the way. Both liberals and conservatives, maybe. There's been a sink in political culture and standards. It's utterly astonishing, right? And it's not like the old man talk out. It's not like old times. Like it's literally, in terms of history of political thought and theory and philosophy, there's been an intellective contraction, restriction, narrowing down to simplistic contents that didn't exist up to a certain time. The sense of institutions, for example, I can say, when you look at certain countries, we're usually, doing well in the long run. In terms like, think of corruption, crime. I mean, things have, on certain levels actually have unfortunately increased, but in the last, 50 years, we have improved considerably at many levels. Maybe now we are stagnating again. I don't know really. I wouldn't like to say that, but specifically, this political culture, where does it go? Right? What's the hope? It's just it's not just about it. It's about the fact that it's apparently functional to the either to the masses or the specific political systems that are maybe rigged in a certain way. Like there is an evident problem also of mechanisms of election and representation, right? We do have problems in that regard. We can't go on forever with the same systems at a point. Many people advocate for saying, okay, let's not vote everybody, because it seems, fortunately now, that it's not a matter of getting more or less rights like it could be 100 years ago. Now everybody have the essential rights, maybe just certain very tiny minorities that at a certain point they do not have, or maybe larger ones that have certain issues that must be fixed, but they're not basically because of a specific lack of rights that are already enforced, as a matter of fact, but some subtler problem. But at this point, it's just that most people simply do not seem to understand the world they live in, at the point that we're wondering whether they are useful or not in the decisional process, which doesn't mean they should be cut out from voting, but maybe, giving a more or less weight to single votes, that is just to say, based on fundamentally intelligence and on maybe other social responsibilities. What do we have to do? Because it's not become clear. The lack of a direction, the lack of a lead, and this detachment, this perceived at least detachment from political representation and the masses, that also stand problems like populism that are not the correct answer to it, is definitely symptomatic of a greater malaise that must be addressed very seriously, and according to me passes largely through education, right? And not the usual thing of the education of the new innovative methods and other stuff. Kids have to be free to do things that, no, really of education in the sense that people are not informed, they're not provided enough scientific evidence or criteria to become adults, right? For at least as far as the current today's society, let's say, should require. That's surely a problem. But this makes us a vulnerable society, and somebody could take advantage of it. And it's not even to be, say, sure that that within our own societies there's somebody that is not already taking advantage of it, because that's also actually probably the most concrete threat that we're currently facing. It's not external; it's really domestic. And maybe the discrepancy starts from this problem, right? The fact that we do not recognize anymore that this separation derives from a deep divide in our society. That's it, maybe. But whatever. This has gone beyond. I would have liked to talk about more about darker, let's say, topics, saying how fundamentally our societies are doomed or something like that. But I thought this is exactly the point. I mean, giving not just hope, but constructive proposals for keeping an expectation, for committing people to a common good that should be the central concern of a society. But anyhow, for now we'll stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.